This is the iPhone 14 Pro Max. A lot has been said about Apple's latest flagship, the dynamic island, the always-on display, the 48 megapixel camera, and all the rest of it. But nobody's really talked about what it's like to live with this phone after 3 months. Well, I have, and I have some thoughts. You've seen the September keynote, right? We all lost our collective minds when we saw the pill-shaped cutout expand and shrink. It showed calls, you could control your music in there, it all promised a whole new way of interacting with the iPhone. I'm here to tell you that nothing's really changed. Don't get me wrong, the dynamic island is very cool to show off to your friends. And when it works, it's amazing how fluid everything looks. I mean, just look at this. Wow. But let's be honest, how many times do you actually mess around with these things? Most of the time, when you're not actively using the phone, the screen is locked, and you have to unlock the screen to actually use the dynamic island. Plus, you can already control music, voice recordings, and timers through the lock screen. Even when you're actually using the phone, the functionality is quite limited. Take the music controls. You go in, pause your music, go out to do whatever it is you guys do, and then it just sort of disappears. Why? Now I have to slow it down to the control center and press play. All the while the dynamic island is showing nothing. As we've mentioned before, the dynamic island is less of an interactive element and more of a separate notification system. It's here where you really notice the smoothness and the fluidity of the animations. But again, there are some issues. First of all, I find it quite strange that your actual notifications don't use the dynamic island at all. Instead, they appear as a separate bubble from the pill-shaped cutout, completely going against Apple's goal of seamlessly fusing hardware and software. It breaks the illusion completely. Secondly, almost all functionality stops once you use the phone in landscape. It just becomes this big black pill that blocks your content. Even when it tries to show you something, like when the phone is unlocking the Apple Watch, it phases into the top corner instead, which looks very awkward. And last but not least, the dynamic island is still kind of buggy, even after several iOS updates. If I flick the silent switch and then rotate the phone, what the heck is this? But perhaps the biggest problem is the lack of third-party support, even after 3 months. If you use Google Maps and swipe up, it only shows an indicator that the app is using GPS. Waze omits it completely, and while there is live activity support, apps like Grab and Foodpanda still do not use it. That means you can't see where your Grab car or your food delivery is. No matter what you think of the dynamic island, there's no doubt it's affixed to one hell of a display. It's a 120Hz AMOLED touchscreen that measures 6.1 inches across or 6.7 inches on this iPhone 14 Pro Max. And it's gorgeous, with great colors and contrasts. It also gets very bright, peaking at a whopping 2000 nits, so it's legible even under our harsh sunlight that's usually brighter than my future. Also new is the always-on display, which has finally come to the iPhone. Unfortunately, that's what a lot of people have been complaining about. I don't actually mind it. I like seeing a dimmed version of my wallpaper when my phone is just sitting there. But not everyone likes having their phone look like it's on all of the time. I know 3 people with an iPhone 14 Pro, and all of them turned the AOD off for that reason alone. Apple has at least given users some options with the iOS 16.2 update, letting them turn off the wallpaper and the notifications in the settings. But there's still no ability to have smaller notification icons like pretty much every Android phone out there. You either have the big bubbles that everyone can see or none at all. And there's still no way for you to see your battery percentage. You have to double tap the screen and may like Apple. Speaking of the battery, the AOD also has a significant impact on battery life, wiping out about an hour of screen on time. I average between 6 to 7 hours of screen on time with the larger 14 Pro Max in everyday use, and the phone usually lasts about a day and a half before needing to be recharged. With the AOD turned off, I was able to hit around 8 hours of screen on time. An extra hour doesn't seem like a lot, but it's enough for the phone to continue soldiering on for a full 2 days. That's with moderate use. Recently, I used the 14 Pro Max on a trip to Singapore, relying a lot on Google Maps for walking directions, taking lots of photos, and then sharing them on social media. In that time, I consistently ran down the battery by the end of the day. The bottom line is that the 14 Pro Max will reliably get you a full day's use at a bare minimum. And most people will be able to achieve much longer battery life than that. But heavy users will still need to charge their phones every night, so do bear that in mind. This year, Apple has given you extra incentive to purchase the Pro models, reserving the new A16 Bionic chip for those phones. As expected, the more expensive devices trounced the old A15 in the regular 14 and 14 Plus in benchmark tests. However, in the real world, the difference isn't quite so clear-cut. This phone flies to iOS, but so does the 14 Plus that I've also been using. Apple is so far ahead of Qualcomm in terms of performance that it's been able to rest on its laurels a little bit. Say what you want about the possible cynical reasons for sticking with the older chip on lesser models, but the truth is that most users won't notice the difference. One thing that has surprised me is the amount of crashes I've been getting on this phone. Every so often when I'm just using the phone normally, I get a black screen with a loading circle in the middle. It's nothing major, everything goes back to normal, it's just a slight interruption. I don't know if it's a problem with the phone or iOS 16 or just my install in particular, but it's something I should point out. As for gaming performance, the 14 Pro Max has been great, but not without some issues. I was able to run Apex Legends at 60 FPS at extreme HD settings without any major stutters, just a few missed frames here and there. I was also able to ramp up the frame rate to a maximum of 80 FPS, though there were some slowdowns that I suspect were thermal related. Not bad, but there's some room for improvement here. Last but not least, the bit everyone has been waiting for, and that's the cameras. This year, Apple has finally budged from the 12 megapixels it has offered on the main camera for years. It's now quadrupled it to 48 megapixels. It still pixel bins down to 12 megapixels for reduced noise, but you can get the full pixel count in the form of 70 megabyte raw files if you so wish. It's also a much larger sensor than before, and it comes with a new imaging pipeline called the Photonic Engine, so it should provide better image quality. That's on paper. In reality, the 14 Pro Max continues to take excellent photos in a wide variety of lighting situations, with good dynamic range and natural colors and contrast. That's the same thing iPhones have been doing for years. There is slightly better detail coming from the 48 megapixel sensor, but oddly, not to the same level as some of its competitors. Pixel peep the photos against those from a Huawei Mate 50 Pro, and you can see that the latter does retain more detail. To compensate, Apple has ramped up the noise reduction and sharpening it applies to photos. Sometimes that works to your advantage. Images of buildings look particularly crisp and clean. Other times, however, the excess sharpening ironically wipes out a lot of fine detail, especially hair. It also introduces a bit of haloing that is especially visible in low-light photos. The good news is that unless you zoom in into all your photos, you'll still be perfectly happy with the photos coming from the main camera. The 14 Pro Max also delivers consistent image quality across its other cameras, which still have 12 megapixel sensors. That's more than you can say about some of its rivals. Okay, the ultra-wide is a little bit soft, but the 3x telephoto is almost as sharp as the main camera. The 14 Pro can also take a 12 megapixel crop of the middle of the main sensor to give you an optical 2x zoom, which is ingenious, and it works well, even though the lack of pixel binning means the images end up being noisier in low light. As for the selfie camera, it captures very similar photos as before, but with slightly more bokeh as a result of the larger aperture. That means the selfie camera now has to have autofocus to keep the subject sharp. Even so, it's not so different that most people will notice. Portrait mode is one area where the iPhone has fallen behind its rivals. It still misses out on certain areas, and it also can't cut out individual strands of hair like the Samsung Galaxy S22. I do, however, like the bokeh quality. It's still the most lifelike out of all of the other smartphones. At least Apple maintains its advantage when it comes to videos, which come out incredibly stable and look amazing on the HDR display. The latest iPhones also come with a new feature called Action Mode, which uses an extreme crop of the sensor to deliver an aggressive video stabilization, similar to GoPro's Hypersmooth. Apple says this negates the need for a gimbal, but don't throw yourself out just yet. If you're running and jumping with your phone in the hand, you'll still cause vibrations to show up in your videos. It seems like I'm having a downer on this phone, but I'm really not. This is still a fantastic flagship, one that has a gorgeous display, an excellent battery life with a few caveats, blazing fast performance, and a set of cameras that continue to take great photos. It's when you start to nitpick that you find a few chinks in the iPhone 14 Pro's armor. The big new ideas are great, but they haven't been polished to the usual Apple sheen. But don't let that put you off. Unless you're the sort of person who pores over every single detail of the device, you'll be more than happy with the 14 Pro, especially if you're moving up from something like an iPhone 11 or older. And if you're switching over from an Android device, this phone will be more like your old phone than ever before, in most of the ways that matter. But, and this is a very important but, the 14 Pro also offers a very tantalizing glimpse at the sort of world-beating phone that Apple will probably come out later this year. So, unless you really need that new phone right now, you might want to hold off to see what comes next. Thank you so much for watching this review of the iPhone 14 Pro Max. What do you think? I particularly want to know what you think as an owner of the current iPhone 14 Pro. Let me know in the comments down below. As usual, if you like this video, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. As always, stay awesome. I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.